Chapter 11, The Idea of Pure Logic. Wishing to gain a provisional image, sketched with a few characteristic touches, of the goal aimed at by the individual discussions which follow these prolegomena, we shall now try to bring conceptual clarity to that idea of pure logic, for which our critical discussions up to this point have more or less prepared us. 62. The unity of science. The interconnection of things and the interconnection of truth. Science is, in the first place, a unified item in anthropology. 1T1 unity of acts of thinking, of thought dispositions, as well as of certain external arrangements pertinent thereto. What makes this unified whole anthropological, and what especially makes it psychological, are not here our concern. We are rather interested in what makes science science, which is certainly not its psychology, nor any real context into which acts of thought are fitted, but a certain objective or ideal interconnection which gives these acts a unitary objective relevance, and, in such unitary relevance, an ideal validity. More definiteness and clearness are, however, needed at this point. Two meanings can be attached to this objective interconnection which ideally pervades scientific thought, and which gives unity to such thought, and so to science as such. It can be understood as an interconnection of the things to which our thought experiences, actual or possible, are intentionally directed, or, on the other hand, as an interconnection of truths, in which this unity of things comes to count objectively as being what it is. These two things are given together a priori, and are mutually inseparable. Nothing can be without being thus or thus determined, and that it is thus and thus determined, is the self-subsistent truth which is the necessary correlate of the self-subsistent being. What holds of single truths, or single states of affairs, plainly also holds of interconnections of truths or of states of affairs. This self-evident inseparability is not, however, identity. In these truths or interconnections of truths the actual existence of things and of interconnections of things finds expression. But the interconnections of truths differ from the interconnections of things, which are truly in the former. This at once appears in the fact that truths which hold of truths do not coincide with truths that hold of the things posited in such truths. To forestall misunderstandings, I must expressly emphasize the fact that I use the words objectivity, object, thing, etc., always in the widest sense, in accordance, therefore, with my preferred sense of the term knowledge. An object of knowledge may as readily be what is real as what is ideal, a thing or an event or a species of a mathematical relation, a case of being or of what ought to be. This applies automatically to expressions like unified objectivity, interconnection of things, etc. Both sorts of unity are given to us, and can only by abstraction be thought apart, in judgment or, more precisely, in knowledge, the unity of objectivity, on the one hand, and of truth, on the other. The expression knowledge is wide enough to cover both simple acts of knowing, as well as logically unified interconnections of knowledge, however complicated, either of these, considered as a whole, is a cognitive act. If now we perform an act of cognition, or, as I prefer to express it, live in one, we are concerned with the object that it, in its cognitive fashion, means and postulates. If this act is one of knowing in the strictest sense, i.e. if our judgment is inwardly evident, then its object is given in primal fashion, origine. The state of affairs comes before us, not merely putatively, but as actually before our eyes, and in it the object itself, as the object that it is, i.e. just as it is intended in this act of knowing and not otherwise, as bearer of such and such properties, as the term of such relations, etc. It is not merely putatively, but actually thus, and as actually thus it is given to our knowledge, which means that it is not merely thought, judged, but known to be such. Otherwise put, its being thus is a truth actually realized, individualized in the experience of the inwardly evident judgment. If we reflect on this individualization, we perform an ideational abstraction, and the truth itself, instead of our former object, becomes our apprehended object. We hereby apprehend the truth as the ideal correlate of the transient subjective act of knowledge, as standing opposed in its unity to the unlimited multitude of possible acts of knowing, and of knowing individuals. To the interconnections of knowledge there ideally correspond interconnections of truths. Suitably understood, these are not merely complexes of truths, but complex truths, which therefore themselves in their totality fall under the concept of truth. There also the sciences belong, the word understood objectively in the sense of unified truth. In the general correlation which subsists between truth and objectivity, there is a unitary objectivity which corresponds to the unity of truth in one and the same science. This is the unity of the scientific field. In relation to this, all the singular truths of the same science belong together in their subject matter, an expression which, as we shall see later, seems to be here used in a wider sense than usual. Compare the end of 64. 63. Continuation. The unity of theory. We may now ask what constitutes the unity of a science, and therewith the unity of its field. For not every putting of truths together in a single association of truths, which might remain an entirely external one, constitutes a science. To a science, as we said in our first chapter, a certain unified interconnection of demonstration pertains. This too, however, is not enough. It points to demonstration, to proof as something essentially pertaining to the idea of science, but fails to say what sort of unity of proof constitutes a science. To reach clearness, we begin by making certain general pronouncements. Scientific knowledge is, as such, grounded knowledge. To know the ground of anything means to see the necessity of its being so and so. Necessity as an objective predicate of a truth, which is then called a necessary truth, is tantamount to the law-governed validity of the state of affairs in question. To see a state of affairs as a matter of law is to see its truth as necessarily obtaining, and to have knowledge of the ground of the state of affairs or of its truth. All these are equivalent expressions. To a natural equivocation, of course, leads us to call every general truth that itself utters a law, a necessary truth. Corresponding to our first defined sense, it would have been better to call it the explanatory ground of a law, from which a class of necessary truths follows. Truths divide into individual and general truths. The former contain, whether explicitly or implicitly, assertions regarding the actual existence of individual singulars, whereas the latter are completely free from this, and only permit us to infer, purely from concepts, the possible existence of what is individual. Individual truths are as such contingent. If in their case one speaks of a grounded explanation, one is concerned with the proof of their necessity under certain presupposed circumstances. If the interconnection of one fact with others is one of law, then its existence, resting on the laws which govern interconnections of the sort in question, and on the assumption of the pertinent circumstances, is determined as a necessary existence. If we are not dealing with the proof of a factual, but of a general truth, which again has the character of a law in respect of its possible application to facts falling under it, we are referred to certain general laws, which, by way of specialization, not individualization, and deductive consequence yield the proposition to be proved. The proof of general laws necessarily leads to certain laws which in their essence, i.e. intrinsically, and not merely subjectively or anthropologically, are not further provable. These are called basic laws. The systematic unity of the ideally closed sum total of laws resting on one basic legality, G sets lich keet, as their final ground, and arising out of it through systematic deduction, is the unity of a systematically complete theory. This basic legality may here either consist of one basic law or a conjunction of homogeneous basic laws. We possess theories in this strict sense in universal arithmetic, in geometry, in analytical mechanics, in mathematical astronomy, etc. Our concept of theory is usually a relative one, i.e. a theory is relative to a multiplicity of single items that it governs, for which it provides the explanatory grounds. Universal arithmetic gives us an explanatory theory for numerical and concrete number propositions, analytical mechanics for mechanical facts, mathematical astronomy for the facts of gravitation, etc. The possibility of taking on the function of explanation is an obvious consequence of the essence of a theory in our absolute sense. In a looser sense, we mean by theory a deductive system in which the last grounds are not basic laws in the strict sense of the word, but, as genuine grounds, take us closer to these. In the gradations of a closed theory, a theory in this relaxed sense forms a step. We also note the following difference: every explanatory interconnection is deductive, but not every deductive interconnection is explanatory. All grounds are premises, but not all premises are grounds. Every deduction is indeed necessary, i.e. it obeys laws, but that its conclusions follow according to laws, the laws of inference, does not mean that they follow from laws which in a pregnant sense serve to ground them. One tends, indeed, to call every premise, and especially a universal one, a ground for the consequences which flow from it, a noteworthy equivocation. 64. The essential and extra-essential principles that give science unity. Abstract, concrete and normative sciences. We are now in a position to answer the question raised above. What makes truths belong together in a single science? What constitutes their unity of subject matter? The principle of unity may be of two sorts, essential and extra-essential. The truths of a science are essentially one if their connection rests on what above all makes a science a science. A science is, as we know, grounded knowledge, i.e. explanation or proof, in the pointed sense. Essential unity among the truths of a single science is unity of explanation. But all explanation points to a theory, and has its goal in the knowledge of the basic laws, the principles of explanation. Unity of explanation means, therefore, theoretical unity, which means, on what was said above, homogeneous unity of legal base, and, lastly, homogeneous unity of explanatory principles. The sciences whose field is determined by the standpoint of theory, of unity of principle, which embrace in ideal closure all possible facts and general items whose principles of explanation have a single legal base, are called, not very suitably, abstract sciences. The best name for them would really be theoretical sciences. This expression is, however, used in opposition to practical and normative sciences, and we too have used it above in this sense. Following a suggestion of J. von Kreis 3, one could say, almost as characteristically, that these sciences are nomological, insofar as their unifying principle, as well as their essential aim of research, is a law. The name explanatory science, which we have used from time to time, will also do, provided it is used to stress the unity reached by explanation, rather than explanation itself. There are, in the second place, external standpoints which range truths into one science. The nearest to hand is the unity of the thing in a more literal sense. One connects all the truths whose content relates to one and the same individual object, or to one and the same empirical genus. This is the case in regard to the concrete, or, to use von Kreis's term, the ontological sciences, such as geography, history, astronomy, natural history, anatomy, etc. The truths of geography are united by their relation to the Earth. The truths of meteorology concern, even more restrictedly, the weather phenomena of the Earth, etc. These sciences are also often called descriptive, and this name is allowable, since the unity of description is fixed by the empirical unity of the object or the class, and it is this descriptive unity which, in the sciences here involved, determines the science's unity. But the word should of course not be so understood as if descriptive science is aimed at mere description, which would contradict our guiding concept of science. Since it is possible that explanation which is directed towards empirical unities, leads to widely divergent, or quite heterogeneous theories and theoretical sciences, we rightly call the unity of the concrete science an extra-essential one. It is at any rate clear that the abstract or nomological sciences are the genuine, basic sciences, from whose theoretical stock the concrete sciences must derive all that theoretical element by which they are made sciences. Quite understandably, it is enough if the concrete sciences attach the objects they describe to the lower rungs of law in the nomological sciences, and at best indicate the main direction of ascending explanation. For the reduction to principles, and the general build-up of explanatory theories, is the proper field of the nomological sciences. It already exists in such sciences, where fully developed, in the most universal form and as a finished achievement. We are of course not pronouncing on the relative worth of the two sorts of sciences. Our interest in theory is not our only interest, nor the sole determinant of value. Aesthetic, ethical, and, in a wider sense, practical interests can attach to what is individual, and impart the highest value to its detailed description and explanation when, however, our purely theoretical interest sets the tone. The single individual and the empirical connection do not count intrinsically, or they count only as a methodological point of passage in the construction of a general theory. The theoretical natural scientist, or the natural scientist in the context of purely theoretic, mathematicizing discussion, sees the Earth and stars quite differently from the geographer and the astronomer. They are to him per se indifferent and count merely as examples of gravitating masses in general. We must finally make mention of yet another extra-essential principle of scientific unity, the principle which grows out of a unitary evaluative interest, which is therefore objectively determined by unitary basic value, or by unitary basic norm, as has been fully discussed in Chapter 11:14. This constitutes mutual belongingness as regards subject matter among the truths in the normative sciences, or the unity of the field in question. Talk of mutual belongingness as regards subject matter is most naturally taken to mean a belongingness grounded in things, in subject matters themselves. Here only a unity in terms of theoretical law or of the concrete thing will be relevant, and our conception will place normative unity over against unity of subject matter in a single opposition. As appears from our previous discussion, normative sciences depend on theoretical sciences, above all on sciences theoretical in the narrowest sense of being nomological, so that we can again say that they derive the theoretical element, which alone renders them scientific, from those theoretical sciences. 65. The question as to the ideal conditions of the possibility of science or of theory in general. The question as it relates to actual knowledge, we now raise an important question as to the conditions of the possibility of science in general. Since the essential aim of scientific knowledge can only be achieved through theory, in the strict sense of the nomological sciences, we replace our question by a question as to the conditions of the possibility of theory in general. A theory as such consists of truths, and its form of connection is a deductive one. To answer our question is therefore also to answer the more general question as to the conditions of the possibility of truth in general, and again of deductive unity in general. The historical echoes in the form of our question are of course intentional. We are plainly concerned with a quite necessary generalization of the question as to the conditions of the possibility of experience, Erfahrung. The unity of an experience is for Kant the unity of objective legality. It falls, therefore, under the concept of theoretical unity. The sense of our question needs, however, to be more precisely fixed. It might very well be at first understood in the subjective sense, in which case it would be better expressed as a question as to the conditions of the possibility of theoretical knowledge in general, or, more generally, of inference in general or knowledge in general, and in the case of any possible human being. Such conditions are in part real, in part ideal. We shall ignore the former, the psychological conditions. Naturally the possibility of knowledge in a psychological regard embraces all the causal conditions on which our thinking depends. Ideal conditions for the possibility of knowledge may, as said before, be of two sorts. They are either noetic conditions which have their grounds, a priori, in the idea of knowledge as such, without any regard to the empirical peculiarity of human knowledge as psychologically conditioned, or they are purely logical conditions, i.e. they are grounded purely in the content of our knowledge. It is evident a priori, as regards the former, that thinking subjects must be in general able to perform, for example, all the sorts of acts in which theoretical knowledge is made real. We must, in particular, as thinking beings, be able to see propositions as truths, and to see truths as consequences of other truths, and again to see laws as such, to see laws as explanatory grounds, and to see them as ultimate principles, etc. But it is also, on the other hand, inwardly evident that truths are what they are, and that, in particular, laws, grounds, principles are what they are, whether we have insight into them or not. Since they do not hold in so far as we have insight into them, but we can only have insight into them in so far as they hold, they must be regarded as objective or ideal conditions of the possibility of our knowledge of them. A priori laws, accordingly, relating to truth as such, to deduction as such and to theory as such, i.e. to the universal essence of these ideal unities, must be characterized as laws which express the conditions for knowledge in general, or for deductive and theoretical knowledge in general, conditions which have their pure foundation is the content of knowledge. Plainly we are here concerned with the priori conditions of knowledge, which can be discussed and investigated apart from all relation to the thinking subject and to the idea of subjectivity in science. The laws in question have a meaning content which is quite free from such relation. They do not talk, even in ideal fashion, of knowing, judging, inferring, representing, proving etc., but of truth, concept, proposition, syllogism, ground and consequent etc., as we fully said above, 47. Obviously these laws may undergo self-evident transformations through which they acquire an express relation to knowledge and the knowing subject, and now themselves pronounce on real possibilities of knowledge. Here as elsewhere, a priori assertions regarding ideal possibilities arise through the transferred application of ideal relationships, expressed in purely general propositions, to empirical instances. Compare the arithmetical example in 23 above. The ideal conditions of knowledge which we have called noetic as opposed to those which are logically objective, are, basically, no more than such modifications of the insights, the laws which pertain to the pure content of knowledge, as render them fruitful for the criticism of knowledge, and, by further modifications, for practical, logical normativity. For the normative modifications of the jaws of pure logic, which we spoke of above, also come in here. 66b. The question as it relates to the content of knowledge. Our treatment has shown that questions as to the ideal conditions of the possibility of knowledge in general, and of theoretical knowledge in particular, ultimately lead us back to certain laws, whose roots are to be found purely in the content of knowledge, or of the categorical concepts that it falls under, and which are so abstract that they contain no reference to knowledge as an act of a knowing subject. These laws, or the categorical concepts which enter into them, are what are to be understood as constituting the conditions of the possibility of theory in general, in the objectively ideal sense. For it is possible to raise questions as to the conditions of possibility, not only in regard to theoretical knowledge, as we have so far done, but also in regard to its content, i.e. we can raise them directly in regard to theory itself. We then understand by theory, let us again stress, a certain ideal content of possible knowledge, just as in the case of truth, law etc. There is a single truth, which corresponds to the multitude of individual acts of knowledge having the same content, which is just their ideally identical content. In like manner, the ideally identical content of a theory corresponds to the multitude of individual knowledge combinations, in each of which, whether occurring now or then, in these subjects or in those, the same theory comes to be known. It is accordingly not made up of acts but of purely ideal elements, of truths, and that in purely ideal forms, those of ground and consequent. If we now directly relate our question as to conditions of possibility, to theory in the objective sense and to theory in general, such a possibility can only have the sense which applies to other objects of pure conception. From such objects, we are led back to concepts, and possibility means no more than the obtaining, /to, or rather essentiality, Wesen of dikkeit, of the concepts in question. This is what is often called the reality as opposed to the imaginariness of concepts, which latter could better be called essencelessness. In such a sense, one speaks of real definitions which guarantee the possibility, the obtaining, the reality of the defined concept, and again of the opposition between real and imaginary numbers, geometrical figures etc. Talk of possibility in regard to concepts becomes equivocal through a transfer. What is in an authentic sense possible is the existence of objects falling under the relevant concepts, a possibility guaranteed a priori through knowledge of conceptual essence, which flashes upon us, for example, as the result of such an object's being intuitively presented. The essentiality of the concept is then likewise spoken of as a possibility in a transferred sense. In this connection questions as to the possibility of a theory as such, and as to the conditions on which such possibility depends, gain an easily grasped sense. The possibility or essentiality of a theory in general is assured by our perspicuous knowledge of some definite theory. The wider question will however be, what are the universal, law-governed conditions of this possibility of theory in general? What therefore constitutes the ideal essence of theory as such? What are the primitive possibilities out of which the possibility of theory is constituted, or, what is the same, what are the primitive essential concepts out of which the concept of theory, itself an essential concept, is constituted? And further, what are the pure laws which, rooted in these concepts, impart unity to all theory as such, laws which pertain to the form of theory as such, and which determine, in a priori fashion, the possible, essential, modifications or species of theory? If these ideal concepts or laws delimit the possibility of theory in general, if, in other words, they express what essentially pertains to the idea of theory, it immediately follows that each putative theory only is a theory to the extent to which it accords with these concepts or laws. The logical justification of a concept, i.e. of its ideal possibility, is achieved by going back to its intuitive or deducible essence. Logical justification of a given theory as such, i.e. justification in virtue of its pure form, demands that we go back to the essence of its form, and so to the concepts and laws which are ideal constituents of theory in general, the conditions of its possibility, which regulate, in a priori, deductive fashion, all specialization of the idea of theory in its possible kinds. Things are here as they are in the wider field of deduction, for example in the case of simple syllogisms. Though they may be intrinsically illuminated by insight, they nonetheless receive their final, deepest justification by recourse to the formal, syllogistic law which imparts insight into the a priori ground of syllogistic interconnection. The same holds in the case of any deduction, however complicated, and especially in the case of a theory. In perspicuous, theoretical thought we gain insight into the grounds of some state of affairs explained, but the deeper going insight into the essence of the theoretical linkage which itself constitutes the theoretical content of such thought, and the a priori laws on which such thought achievement depends, are first reached when we track down the form, the law, and the interweavings of theory, at the quite different level of knowledge to which they belong. To point to profounder insights and justifications, serves to bring out the supreme value of the theoretical investigations which help to solve our suggested problem. We are dealing with systematic theories which have their roots in the essence of theory, with an a priori, theoretical, nomological science which deals with the ideal essence of science as such, and which accordingly has parts relating to systematic theories whose empirical, anthropological aspect it excludes. In a profound sense, we are dealing with the theory of theory, with the science of the sciences. Its achievement in enriching our knowledge must, of course, be kept separate from its problems themselves, and from the proper content of their solution. 67. The tasks of pure logic. First, the fixing of the pure categories of meaning, the pure categories of objects and their law-governed combinations. Having provisionally fixed the idea of the a priori discipline whose deeper understanding will be the goal of our efforts, we may now summarize the tasks that we shall assign to it. 3 sets of tasks must be distinguished. We must first of all lay down the more important concepts, in particular all the primitive concepts which make possible the interconnected web of knowledge as seen objectively, and particularly the web of theory. We must also clarify these concepts scientifically. We are, in other words, concerned with the concepts which constitute the idea of unified theory, or with the concepts which are connected with these through ideal laws. Into such a constitution second-order concepts, i.e. concepts of concepts and of other ideal unities, naturally enter. A given theory is a certain deductive combination of given propositions which are themselves certain sorts of combinations of given concepts. The idea of the pertinent form of the theory arises if we substitute variables for these given elements, whereby concepts of concepts and of other ideas replace straightforward concepts. Here belong the concepts, concept, proposition, truth, etc. The concepts of the elementary connective forms naturally play a constitutive role here, those connective forms, in particular, which are quite generally constitutive of the deductive unity of propositions, for example the conjunctive, disjunctive, hypothetical linkage of propositions to form new propositions. Such a role is also played by the forms of connection of inferior elements of meaning into one simple proposition, which in their turn lead to the varied subject forms, predicate forms, forms of conjunctive and disjunctive connection, plural forms, etc. Fixed laws govern the gradual complications through which an unending multiplicity of ever new forms emerges out of our primitive set. These laws of complication make possible a sweeping oversight of the concepts derivable from the primitive concepts and forms. These naturally belong, together with this sweeping oversight itself, in the field of research dealt with here. Compare Investigation 4 in Volume 2. In close connection with the concepts so far mentioned, i.e. the categories of meaning, and married to them by ideal laws, are other correlative concepts such as object, state of affairs, unity, plurality, number, relation, connection, etc. These are the pure, the formal objective categories. These too must be taken into account. In both cases we are dealing with nothing but concepts, whose notion makes clear that they are independent of the particularity of any material of knowledge, and under which all the concepts, propositions and states of affairs that specially appear in thought, must be ordered. They arise therefore solely in relation to our varying thought functions. Their concrete basis is solely to be found in possible acts of thought, as such, or in the correlates which can be grasped in these. See 62 above and Investigation 6, 44 in Volume 2. All these concepts must now be pinned down, their origin must in each case be investigated. Not that psychological questions as to the origin of the conceptual presentations or presentational dispositions here in question have the slightest interest for our discipline. This is not what we are inquiring into. We are concerned with the phenomenological origin, or, if we prefer to rule out unsuitable talk of origins, only bred in confusion, we are concerned with insight into the essence of the concepts involved, looking methodologically to the fixation of unambiguous, sharply distinct verbal meanings. We can achieve such an end only by intuitive representation of the essence in adequate ideation, or, in the case of complicated concepts, through knowledge of the essentiality of the elementary concepts present in them, and of the concepts of their forms of combination. All these are seemingly trivial, preparatory tasks. To a large extent they are necessarily clothed in the form of discussions of terminology, and readily seen to the layman to be barren, pettifogging word exercises. But as long as concepts are not distinguished and made clear to ideational intuition, by going back to their essence, further effort is hopeless. In no field of knowledge is equivocation more fatal, in none have confused concepts so hindered the progress of knowledge, or so impeded the insight into its true aims, as in the field of pure logic. The critical analyses of these prolegomena have everywhere shown this. It is impossible to overestimate the importance of this first group of problems. It is doubtful whether they do not in fact involve the greatest difficulties in the whole discipline. 68. Secondly, the laws and theories which have their grounds in these categories. Our second group of problems lies in the search for the laws grounded in the two above classes of categorical concepts, which do not merely concern possible forms of complication and transformation of the theoretical items they involve, see Investigation 1v, but rather the objective validity of the formal structures which thus arise, on the one hand, the truth or falsity of meanings as such, purely on the basis of their categorical formal structure, on the other hand, in relation to their objective correlates, the being and not being of objects as such, of states of affairs as such, again on the basis of their pure, categorical form. These laws, which concern meanings and objects as such, with the widest universality conceivable, the universality of logical categories, are in themselves theories. See Investigation I, 29. We have, on the one side, the side of meaning, theories of inference, for example syllogistics, which is however only one such theory. On the other side, the side of the correlates, we have the pure theory of pluralities, which has its roots in the concepts of a plurality, the pure theory of numbers, which has its roots in the concept of a number, each an independently rounded off theory. All the laws here belonging lead to a limited number of primitive or basic laws, which have their immediate roots in our categorical concepts. They must, in virtue of their homogeneity, serve to base an all-comprehensive theory, which will contain the separate theories just mentioned, as relatively closed elements in itself. We are here concerned with the territory of those laws, which in formal universality span all possible meanings and objects, under which every particular theory or science is ranged, which it must obey if it is to be valid. Not that every such theory presupposes every such law as the ground of its possibility and validity. The ideal completeness of the categorical theories and laws in question, rather yields the all-comprehensive fund from which each particular valid theory derives the ideal grounds of essential being appropriate to its form. These are the laws to which it conforms, and through which, as a theory validated by its form, it can be ultimately justified. In so far as theory is an all-embracing unity built out of single, interwoven truths, it is plain that the laws governing the concept of truth, as well as the laws governing the possibility of single combinations of this or that form, will be included in the delimited territory. In spite of, or rather on account of, the fact that theory is the narrower notion, the task of exploring the conditions of its possibility, comprehends more content than the corresponding task in the case of truth in general, and in the case of the primitive forms of propositional combinations. Compare above, 65. 69. Thirdly, the theory of the possible forms of theories or the pure theory of manifolds. When all these investigations have been concluded, we shall have done justice to the idea of a science of the conditions of the possibility of theory in general. We see at once, however, that this science points beyond itself to a completing science, which deals a priori with the essential sorts, forms, of theories and the relevant laws of relation. The idea therefore arises, all of this being taken together, of a more comprehensive science of theory in general. In its fundamental part, the essential concepts and laws which pertain constitutively to the idea of theory will be investigated. It will then go over to differentiating this idea, and investigating possible theories in a priori fashion, rather than the possibility of theory in general. The tasks mentioned have been carried out to a sufficient extent, and it is possible to construct, out of purely categorical concepts, many definite concepts of possible theories or pure forms of theories, whose essential status has been deduced from laws. These distinct forms are not mutually unrelated. There will be a definite, ordered procedure which will enable us to construct the possible forms of theories, to survey their legal connections, and to pass from one to another by varying their basic determining factors, etc. There will be universal propositions, if not for the forms of theory generally, then at least for forms of theory belonging to defined classes, which will govern the legal connection, the transformation and the mutual interchange of these forms. The propositions that must here be affirmed will plainly be of a different content and character from the basic propositions and theorems of theories of the second group, from, for example, syllogistic or arithmetical laws. It is, however, clear from the start that the deduction of such propositions, for there can be no true basic laws in this case, must have their entire basis in the previously mentioned theories. This is a last, highest goal for a theoretical science of theory in general. It is also not indifferent from the point of view of the practical side of knowledge. To fit a theory into its formal class may rather be of the greatest methodological importance. For, with the extension of the deductive, theoretical sphere, the liveliness and freedom of theoretical research also increases, there is increased richness and fruitfulness of method. The solution of problems raised within a theoretical discipline, or one of its theories, can at times derive the most effective methodical help from recourse to the categorial type or, what is the same, to the form of the theory, and perhaps also by going over to a more comprehensive form or class of forms and to its laws. 70. Elucidation of the idea of a pure theory of manifolds. These indications will perhaps seem somewhat obscure. That we are not here dealing with vague fantasies, but with conceptions definite in their content, is shown by formal mathematics in a most entirely general sense, or by the theory of manifolds, the fine flower of modern mathematics. The theory is in fact none other than the partial realization, correlatively transformed, of the ideal just sketched. This is not to say, of course, that mathematicians themselves, guided and likewise limited by interests which concern the field of number and magnitude, have correctly discerned the ideal essence of the new discipline, or have risen to the height of abstraction of an all-comprehensive theory. The objective correlate of the concept of a possible theory, definite only in respect of form, is the concept of a possible field of knowledge over which a theory of this form will preside. Such a field is, however, known in mathematical circles as a manifold. It is accordingly a field which is uniquely and solely determined by falling under a theory of such a form, whose objects are such as to permit of certain associations which fall under certain basic laws of this or that determinate form, here the only determining feature. The objects remain quite indefinite as regards their matter, to indicate which the mathematician prefers to speak of them as thought objects. They are not determined directly as individual or specific singulars, nor indirectly by way of their material species or genera, but solely by the form of the connections attributed to them. These connections are therefore as little determined in content as are their objects, only their form is determined, and determined through the forms of the elementary laws which are assumed to hold of them. These laws then, as they determine a field and its form, likewise determine the theory to be constructed, or, more correctly, the theory's form. In the theory of manifolds, for example, plus is not the sign for numerical addition, but for any connection for which laws of the form a plus b equals b plus a etc. hold. The manifold is determined by the fact that its thought objects permit of these operations, and of others whose compatibility with these can be shown a priori. The most general idea of a theory of manifolds is to be a science which definitely works out the form of the essential types of possible theories or fields of theory, and investigates their legal relations with one another. All actual theories are then specializations or singularizations of corresponding forms of theory, just as all theoretically worked over fields of knowledge are individual manifolds. If the formal theory in question is actually worked out in the theory of manifolds, then all deductive theoretical work in constructing all actual theories of the same form has been done. This is a point of view of the highest methodological importance, without which there can be no talk of understanding the method of mathematics. Not less important than such a going back to pure form, is the closely related ranging of each such form in more comprehensive forms or classes of forms. That we here have a central item in the wonderful, methodological art of mathematics, becomes plain if we look, not merely at the theories of manifolds which arose from generalizations of geometric theory and its forms, but at the first, simplest case of this sort, the extension of the field of real numbers, i.e. of the corresponding form of theory, the formal theory of real numbers, into the formal, two-dimensional field of ordinary complex numbers. In this concept we indeed have the key to the only possible solution of the problem that has not as yet been cleared up, how, for example, in the field of numbers impossible, essenceless, concepts can be methodically treated like real ones. This is not, however, the place to discuss this more closely. When I spoke above of theories of manifolds which arose out of generalizations of geometric theory, I was of course referring to the theory of n-dimensional manifolds, whether Euclidean or non-Euclidean, to Grassmann's theory of extensions, and, among others, to the related theories of A.W. Rowan Hamilton, which can be readily purged of anything geometric. Lie's theory of transformation groups and G. Cantor's investigations into numbers and manifolds also belong here. The manner in which variation of curvature makes the various sorts of space-like manifolds pass into one another, gives the philosopher who has familiarized himself with the elements of the Riemannian-Helmholtzian theory a certain picture of the manner of the mutual legal connection among pure forms of theory of determinately distinct types. It would be easy to show that a knowledge of the true intention of such theories, as pure categorial forms of theory, would banish all metaphysical fog and all mysticism from the mathematical investigations in question. If we use the term space of the familiar type of order of the world of phenomena, talk of spaces for which, for example, the axiom of parallels does not hold, is naturally senseless. It is just as senseless to speak of differing geometries, when geometry names the science of the space of the world of phenomena. But if we mean by space the categorial form of world space, and, correlatively, by geometry the categorial theoretic form of geometry in the ordinary sense, then space falls under a genus, which we can bound by laws, of pure, categorially determinate manifolds, in regard to which it is natural to speak of space in a yet more extended sense. Just so, geometric theory falls under a corresponding genus of theoretically interrelated theory forms determined in purely categorial fashion, which in a correspondingly extended sense can be called geometries of these spatial manifolds. At any rate, the theory of n-dimensional spaces forms a theoretically closed piece of the theory of theory in the sense above defined. The theory of a Euclidean manifold of 3 dimensions is an ultimate ideal singular in this legally interconnected series of a priori, purely categorial theoretic forms, formal deductive systems. This manifold itself is related to our space, i.e. space in the ordinary sense, as its pure categorial form, the ideal genus of which the latter represents so to say an individual singular rather than a specific difference. Another fine example is the theory of complex number systems, within which the theory of ordinary complex numbers is a single item, a last specific difference. In relation to such theories, the arithmetics of number, of ordinal number, of magnitude, of quantite dirigi etc., are more or less like mere individual singulars. To each a formal generic idea corresponds, a theory of absolute integers, of real numbers, of ordinary complex numbers etc., in whose case number is to be taken in a generalized, formal sense. 71. Division of labor. The achievement of the mathematicians and that of the philosophers, these therefore are the problems that we range in the field of pure formal logic in the above defined sense. We thereby give this field its widest possible extension compatible with the idea sketched by us of a science of theory in general. A considerable part of the theories which belong here has been developed as pure analysis or, better, as formal mathematics, and is worked on by mathematicians together with other disciplines not in the full sense pure, i.e. formal, such as geometry, as the science of our space, analytical mechanics etc. The nature of the case really demands a thoroughgoing division of labor here. The construction of theories, the strict, methodical solution of all formal problems, will always remain the home domain of the mathematician. Peculiar methods and setups of research are here presupposed, and are essentially the same in all pure theories. Even the elaboration of syllogistic theory, long enthroned in the very home territories of philosophy and thought to be completed long ago, has recently been taken over by mathematicians, in whose hands it has received undreamt of developments. Theories of new types of inference, ignored or misunderstood by the traditional logic, have at the same time been discovered and worked out with true mathematical elegance. No one can debar mathematicians from staking claims to all that can be treated in terms of mathematical form and method. Only if one is ignorant of the modern science of mathematics, particularly of formal mathematics, and measures it by the standards of Euclid or Adam Rees, can one remain stuck in the common prejudice that the essence of mathematics lies in number and quantity. It is not the mathematician, but the philosopher, who oversteps his legitimate sphere when he attacks mathematicizing theories of logic, and refuses to hand over his temporary foster children to their natural parents. The scorn with which philosophical logicians like to speak of mathematical theories of inference, does not alter the fact that the mathematical form of treatment is in their case, as in the case of all strictly developed theories in the proper sense of this word, the only scientific one, the only one that offers us systematic closure and completeness, and a survey of all possible questions together with the possible forms of their answers. If the development of all true theories falls in the mathematician's field, what is left over for philosophers? Here we must note that the mathematician is not really the pure theoretician, but only the ingenious technician, the constructor, as it were, who, looking merely to formal interconnections, builds up his theory like a technical work of art. As the practical mechanic constructs machines without needing to have ultimate insight into the essence of nature and its laws, so the mathematician constructs theories of numbers, quantities, syllogisms, manifolds, without ultimate insight into the essence of theory in general, and that of the concepts and laws which are its conditions. The like holds of all special sciences. What is 1 TP 6 T Poftage? Picray is not at all what is 1 TP 6 T Pof 1 Pos 110s. It is not, fortunately, essential insight which makes science, in the common, practically most fruitful sense, possible, but scientific instinct and method. For this very reason the ingenious, methodical work of the special sciences, more concerned with practical results and mastery than with essential insight, is in need of a continuous epistemological reflection which only the philosopher can provide, which allows only the interest of pure theory to dominate, and helps it to claim its rights. Philosophical investigation has quite other ends, and therefore presupposes quite other methods and capacities. It does not seek to meddle in the work of the specialist, but to achieve insight in regard to the sense and essence of his achievements as regards method and manner. The philosopher is not content with the fact that we find our way about in the world, that we have legal formulae which enable us to predict the future course of things, or to reconstruct its past course. He wants to clarify the essence of a thing, an event, a cause, an effect, of space, of time etc., as well as that wonderful affinity which this essence has with the essence of thought, which enables it to be thought, with the essence of knowledge, which makes it knowable, with meanings which make it capable of being meant etc. And if science constructs theories in the systematic dispatch of its problems, the philosopher inquires into the essence of theory and what makes theory as such possible etc. Philosophical research so supplements the scientific achievements of the natural scientist and of the mathematician, as for the first time to perfect pure, genuine, theoretical knowledge. The ars inventiva of the special investigator and the philosopher's critique of knowledge are mutually complementary scientific activities, through which complete theoretical insight, comprehending all relations of essence, first comes into being. The following individual investigations preparatory to the philosophical side of our discipline will further elucidate what the mathematician will not and cannot do, but what must nevertheless be done. 72. Broadening of the idea of pure logic. The pure theory of probability is a pure theory of empirical knowledge. The concept of pure logic so far developed covers a theoretically closed circle of problems, essentially relate to the idea of theory. To the extent that no science is possible without grounded explanation, i.e. without theory, pure logic covers the ideal conditions of the possibility of science in general in the most general manner. It must, however, be noted that logic so regarded does not include, as a special case, the ideal conditions of empirical science in general. To inquire into these conditions is of course a more restricted inquiry. Empirical science is also science, and naturally falls, in regard to its theories, under the laws of the sphere delimited above. But ideal laws do not determine the unity of the empirical sciences merely in the form of the laws of deductive unity, since empirical science cannot be reduced merely to its theories. Theoretical optics, i.e. the mathematical theory of optics, does not exhaust the science of optics. Mathematical mechanics is not the whole of mechanics etc. The whole complex apparatus of knowledge processes in which the theories of the empirical sciences arise, and are frequently modified in the course of scientific progress, is certainly not merely subject to empirical, but also to ideal laws. All theory in the empirical sciences is merely putative theory. It explains by means of basic laws which are not for our insight certain, but which are only for this insight probable. The theories themselves only have perspicuous probability, they are provisional, not final theories. The same is in a manner true of the facts which require explanation in theory. We start with such facts, they are taken as given, all that we want is to explain them. But when we rise to the explanatory hypotheses and, after deduction, verification and perhaps repeated modification, accept them as probable laws, the facts themselves do not remain quite unchanged, they too change as the process of knowledge progresses. The added knowledge due to hypotheses that have proved workable, enables us to press ever deeper into the true essence of real being. We progressively correct our conceptions, more or less tainted with inconsistencies, of phenomenal things. Facts are originally given to us only in the sense of being perceived, and likewise in the sense of being remembered. In perception things and events themselves putatively confront us, seen and grasped, so to say, without intervening partition. And what we see before us, we utter in judgments of perception, these are the immediate given facts of science. But, as knowledge progresses, the actual factual content that we concede to perceptual appearances gets altered. The intuitively given things, the things with secondary qualities, come to count as mere appearances. To determine the true element in them at a given time, or, in other words, to determine the empirical object of knowledge objectively, we need a method adjusted to the sense of this objectivity, and a field of scientifically known laws to be gained and steadily extended by this method. All the scientific procedures of the objective sciences of fact are governed, as Descartes and Leibniz saw, not by psychological contingency, but by an ideal norm. We claim that, at any time, there is only one correct attitude in the assessment of the laws which are to explain, and in the fixing of the true facts, and that this is the case at each step in science. When a probable law or theory is rendered untenable by an increment of new empirical instances, we do not conclude that the scientific grounding of this theory must have been mistaken. In the field of our previous experience, the previous theory was the only right one. In the field of extended knowledge, the theory that we now must try to establish is the only right one, the one that must be justified by correct empirical consideration. We perhaps judge, conversely, that an empirical theory has been wrongly established, even if it becomes plain, in another objectively right way, that it is the only suitable theory in the given state of empirical knowledge. From this we must conclude that there must be ideal elements and laws even in the field of empirical thinking, in the sphere of probabilities. In these the possibility of empirical science in general, of the probable knowledge of the real, has its a priori basis. This sphere of pure laws does not relate to the idea of theory or to the more general idea of truth, but to the idea of the empirical unity of explanation, the idea of probability. This yields us a second great foundation for logical technology, which is included in the field of pure logic in a sense to which corresponding width must be given. In the following individual investigations we limit ourselves to the narrower field, which also comes first in the essential arrangement of our subject matter.